what's up, guys? My name is Seth Breedlove. I am a filmmaker from Ohio who runs a production company called Small Town Monsters. I am considered a documentarian, and I also head up this company that focuses on... At one time, it was just these film projects that were sort of centered around the United States that focused on lost and bizarre history and urban legends, things like that. These days, we're a little bigger than that. We have a staff that work for me, so I run an entire company. But I still consider myself primarily a filmmaker and a documentarian. And so what I wanted to do today was talk a little bit about what I do and why I believe it's important. And rather than just do a simple approach to documenting the bizarre, I wanted to maybe talk a little bit about how I do that, how I go about it, what the process is, and how I feel other people might benefit from learning what my process is and how to approach their own, whatever they do, whether it's filmmaking or podcasting or writing books, whatever it is you do. If it involves these topics, I think this talk will be a little beneficial to you. So that is my ultimate goal today, is to give you guys something that will benefit you when you're approaching your own project that involves the paranormal or UFOs, cryptids, whatever it might be. When you're making a project about a topic or topics that the mainstream might consider weird or out there, I find that it is very simple, very easy to not take yourself seriously, maybe even not take the subject itself seriously, because we are so aware of what others might think of us and think of our choice of topics. But as time has gone on, I've seen these topics become more and more mainstream, maybe not to the point where they're accepted, but they're certainly something that I feel is worth being told. These stories are worth being told, they're worth being captured. And so when I first got into this sort of thing, my baptism into all of it was through a film called Minerva Monster. And at the time, I was writing for a local newspaper called the Massillon Independent. I brought a lot of the skills I had learned freelance reporting over to our first film, Minerva Monster. At the time, I wasn't looking at this as a potential job or career. It was just kind of a fun side project. But I know what drew me to the story was the human element. It was the people that were at the heart of the Minerva Monster story. And that story involved a Bigfoot case that took place outside of Minerva, Ohio in 1978. This family was having recurring experiences with a hair-covered creature on the hill behind their house. The creature would come down this hill, approach the house. They started feeding it. And then one night, things took a nasty turn. It supposedly killed their dog. They reported it to the police. The police reported it to the newspaper. The story blew up, and it had a major impact on the lives of the Caton family. That was what drew me to the story, not necessarily this monster lurking on the hill behind their house, but the Catons and how that affected them as people and impacted their lives and standing in the community. I can remember calling the oldest Caton girl and talking to her on the phone for over 2 hours and getting her take on what had happened and how it impacted her. That was what drew me to the story, was the human element. And ultimately, I believe that is the driving force behind what really should sort of draw you to the stories you cover. It's easy to do this backwards, to pick a theme or a UFO story that you think is cool, or a cryptid that you think is fun, or whatever. And then you try to find your in through that. But I've I've done this in reverse and it doesn't work out well. So I try to pick stories that I want to tell based on the people at the heart of them. And I think that is ultimately the most important and aspect of the storytelling and the thing that's going to drive you through. Like I said, when we picked Minerva Monster, it was because of the human element. We've since done stories that had less of a human element to them. I always find that those stories end up being the most forgettable and the hardest to tell, because then you're trying to find something to latch on to for yourself to drive your passion for the story, and it ends up becoming this weird sort of half-hearted attempt at documenting something that you might ultimately lose your interest in. So it's best if you can find yourself a witness or someone connected to the story, a historian or another documentarian who's done work on the same project, whatever it might be, an author, something like that, you can connect with, and you might see the story through their eyes and find yourself being able to bridge off of that and bring something unique to whatever it is you're trying to document. A lot of this is going to be coming from my perspective as a documentarian. So I make films. It's a little different from someone who's doing, say, a journalistic endeavor for like an online publisher or an online magazine, something like that. It's going to be a little different. I do feel like all storytelling sort of has the root is there across all the various forms of storytelling. One of the things that I dig into after I'm past the point of finding my in through one of the people connected to the case I want to cover is the themes I want to grapple with. And it may not be immediately apparent, but all of these stories, whether they're a UFO case, a cryptid, ghost haunting, whatever it is, there's going to be some deeper story, some deeper root to this thing that you're going to want to cover. And that would be the theme of the story you're telling. It might be the easiest thing in the world to not take our own work in these fields seriously, because we ultimately are dealing with subject matter that the mainstream doesn't take seriously. Even in the case of UFOs, a lot of people are going to laugh it off or use the little green men terminology to sort of demean the topic that we're covering. But the fact is that these stories do tell us something about ourselves and the human element, the human condition. And our job ultimately is to find that through line in the story that we're telling. And that's something I've always struggled with. I remember we were making a film called Terror in the Skies, and I'd always heard this thing, like, what is your movie about? And the about part of our movies seems so simple. Well, we're telling a story about flying humanoids in the state of Illinois. And that should be the easiest thing in the world to just focus on. But the fact is that there's much more at play in Terror in the Skies than just the story of flying humanoids in the US. There's an entire section of the United States called the Midwest that has been slowly over time sort of vanishing due to the populations of the small towns, the small communities moving to larger population centers. And what ends up happening with those towns is they sort of dry up and die over the course of like a few decades. There's entire towns that are gone in the Midwest that are no longer there. While we were filming the movie, that became really apparent to me as something that I wanted to cover. I grew up myself in a small town in the United States, and I'd seen that happen in Bolivar, the town I grew up in, and I wanted to cover that to some extent in Terror in the Skies. So the movie became not just about these like flying humanoids and Thunderbird sightings, but also about how the history of those small communities is vanishing alongside the community itself. And ultimately that theme came into place and came into focus for me while I was filming the movie, and then just really was catapulted, I guess, to the forefront of my mind during the actual editing of the film. The same thing can happen in any kind of storytelling, in any kind of documentation you're doing, covering these cases and then sort of putting them out there for the world to see at large. The themes of a story are found very organically, I have found. And so I would strongly recommend that when you're covering one of these stories and then sort of putting it out there for public consumption, you examine far beyond just whatever the topic of the project is that you're working on. Examine what the themes of that are as well, and give your audience or your readers, whatever it is, something else to digest besides just a scary story or a spooky story or a mystery or whatever it might be. Find the theme in there, and then find a way to put that in front of your audience, whatever your audience might be. Another part of identifying what story you want to tell is, does this story actually need told? Ultimately, all stories need to be told. Our job is to tell those stories. If you're interested in how to put that story in front of an audience and how to make it digestible or entertaining or interesting, you are a storyteller. Your ultimate job is to tell stories. It almost doesn't matter what the story is. But the fact is, we are interested in topics. If you're watching this, if you're a part of this con, then you are interested in subject matter that has been put out in front of television audiences and in the written word for decades. And so some of these stories have been covered numerous times. And so one of your jobs becomes, how do I find a unique approach to this topic? And you can actually draw off of the previous 2 points, the human element of the story and the themes that you're grappling with. The other way to approach this is just to come at it from the standpoint of, what can I add to the telling of the story? And so it will come down to the format you're using to tell the story, but the structure is important, the way in which you're approaching telling it, and hopefully you're finding new pieces of the puzzle to put in front of your audience, whether it's some witness who's never spoken up about it, or a historian or an author who has a unique take on the topic at hand. You know, when we were making our Jersey Devil movie, we had the most difficult time making that film because of the fact that the Jersey Devil story has been told so many times for so many people. And one of the unique things about our film became the fact that as we were making it, we really wanted to boil down the original Jersey Devil legend to its core and then sort of dissect it. And it became the first film I'd ever made that truly dissected a legend in a way that was probably far more skeptical than our approach to anything else we've ever made. And we did that through some of the interview subjects, some of the people we interviewed. We avoided going directly to eyewitnesses this time around. We really wanted to focus on the legend and the root of the legend. And so, whereas so many other Jersey Devil documentaries and television shows really focused on talking to witnesses and finding footprint evidence and that kind of thing, we went a completely different route to get to the story we told. Think about that in advance. Your version of pre-production should be, how do I tell this story that's already been told hundreds of times? So the first part of this was kind of focused on figuring out what story you want to tell, how to figure out what story you want to tell, and then how to get into the telling of it before you've actually begun the documentation of it. The second part of this is going to be the key point, which is documenting the story itself. If you're involved in a case that is in the modern era that still has living witnesses or people attached who have documented it in some way who you need involved, whether it's law enforcement or government people or whatever, this is the key point of documenting the bizarre, and that is actually getting people to want to tell a story to you and to gain their trust. I've talked about this in numerous interviews, but the main part of this is to realize that the people you are dealing with are just that. They're people. It's so easy to see someone as simply a witness or a subject, but you have to approach them in a way that is respectful to them as people, and you have to do it in a way that also shows them that you're interested in far more than just them as like a commodity to your project. Whether that's, I've spent countless hours on the phone with witnesses and authors and historians just talking about subject matter that has nothing to do with the project we're working on. And that's one of the key elements of all of this, is building a relationship with the people involved who you need involved in the project to actually tell the story or document the story. Building a relationship with those people that is stronger than just you're sort of collaborating on whatever it is your project is. However you approach that, that's up to you, but just realize that there's going to be more at play than simply calling someone on the phone and saying, I want to ask you some questions about a case, or I want to ask you some questions about what you saw or witnessed, because that typically sort of immediately puts you in their mind as someone who wants something from them, and that's it. You're not going to get very far beyond that point. The second aspect of this that is just absolutely massive that I can't say enough about is the research side of covering these stories. And when I say research, I mean so much more than simply learning about whatever it is that you're covering, whatever the project you're covering. When we make a film, we do months of lead up to that film that involves reading books, listening to podcasts, watching YouTube shows, watching documentaries, and often, if not predominantly, the amount of time we're spending is on subject matter that is only sort of tangentially related to the case that we're covering. So what I mean by that is, like when we were making On the Trail of Bigfoot, The Last Frontier, and Land of the Missing, we knew we were going to Alaska. We knew what parts of Alaska we were going to. And so we wanted to spend time researching things like what the local wildlife is, and what the terrain is like, and what the weather's like, what the history of the region's like, what are the First Nations people that lived there like, what was their life like before white settlers came to the area. And I'll tell you, in doing that, you're going to help open up a lot of storytelling options as well, particularly if you're a documentarian like I am, or an author. You're going to find some of the themes of the project you're working on in doing that research. That has been the case so many times that I've found while working on these projects. But that is a huge element of what you're doing, is the research that goes into it, and be prepared to spend time researching things that might seem like it, not a waste of your time, because it never feels, it's always interesting to learn, but it might seem like it has no bearing on what you're actually doing. Don't be afraid to spend countless hours doing that. Finally, conducting interviews and follow-ups is one of the biggest parts of this process. I don't care if you're making movies or writing a book or whatever, you're going to be conducting interviews with people. The biggest thing I can tell you about this process is to always attempt to put your conversant, the other person on the other side of the line, the other person you're talking to in front of the camera, always focus on putting them at ease. I know when I'm conducting an interview, one of my first questions is typically not at all related to the subject that we're covering. Very often, I'll start off by asking someone what one of their favorite memories is. You know, like what do you love about the area we're in right now? What do you not like about the area we're in right now? Things like that. I've sat down and spent 15, 20 minutes talking about a film with someone on camera before I actually got into discussing the topic that we're there to discuss. And there can't be enough said about how important it is to put the other person at ease, because ultimately, if we're trying to get at the truth of a matter, that comes or will come through a certain level of comfort that they'll have talking to you. That is by far the most important part of conducting an interview, more so than you checking notes and double checking that you have the right questions and that kind of thing. Make the other person comfortable talking to you, and then let that lead into the interview. The final part of all of this is putting everything together, compiling all the information you've done, all the work and hours you've put into doing all the preliminary research and everything, putting that all together, and then dealing with the fallout. So I want to get into a little bit of what happens during the post-production or writing process, and then how to deal with what comes after the actual work has made its way out into the public eye. You know, one thing I see as I've been doing these documentaries over the course of like 10 years is people think that there is this process to the editing or the writing side of things that is very methodical. And some people do work that way. Some people are extremely methodical in the way they put their work together. I am not that guy. I very often have no clue what I am doing with the footage we've compiled until I sit down in front of a screen and start editing it together. And I've found over time that I need to learn to be comfortable with finding my way in the moment. And I cannot say enough how important that is to all of this. Do not be afraid to have no clue what you're doing until you've sat down and are putting everything together. And really, that should be your motto even all the way through the process. Don't be afraid to fail your way through this. That is a huge component of the creative process. That is a huge part of documenting the unusual. Fail your way through. Just don't quit. Ultimately, I've always said, the only reason I'm still here doing what I'm doing today is because I'm too dumb to quit. And be too dumb to quit. That would be the message of this entire thing. What we're doing is important. Documenting the bizarre is important. Be too dumb to quit doing it. Okay, so earlier I talked about examining your themes and figuring out what the theme of the project is. Here's another point to that end. Don't be afraid to re-examine your themes, because very often the themes you picked out ahead of time might not fit within the story that you're now trying to tell. Do not try to cram the themes that you came up with ahead of time into a story that does not want to tell or examine those themes. I know when we were making a movie called Skinwalker, The Howl of the Rougarou, we had originally discussed the idea of the Homa tribe near Homa, Louisiana, and how their stories of the shape-shifting loup-garou had sort of like become this story that evolved over time. And it was basically something we had already grappled with in numerous films, but I'm always interested in how stories evolve. And so we had originally wanted to tell that story. We had also really wanted to focus on the coastal erosion going on in the state of Louisiana and how that was impacting the small towns that exist there. You might remember I talked about Terror in the Skies earlier and how the vanishing towns of the Midwest are being impacted by, like population centers and people moving away from the small communities. This was similar. What happened was once we got into filming the movie, I met this guy named Roy. He was one of the main witnesses. He was a Homa Indian, and he had some very interesting stories about his memories of growing up near Homa when he was a child. And what had happened is over time, the areas that he used to play in and hunt are literally gone. They're wiped out. And he remembered as a kid people talking about not going in the woods, or the Rougarou would get you, or the Bigfoot would get you. And over time, those stories no longer exist there. He doesn't know any of the people that lived there anymore because they've all left that area and moved out, further into the state. And so I became obsessed with that side of things, like how the stories that are told in those communities aren't just disappearing, but they're being moved into other parts of the state, and then they become part of the community of somewhere else where the people that were telling them live, and then they sort of evolve over time. I was also obsessed with that coastal erosion idea and how much the small communities of those towns that were on the coast are sort of forgotten in the landscape of America, especially a lot of the more economically challenged areas. So I examined that in the edit and completely changed a lot of the themes that we were originally going to grapple with in the film. That is a key part of the creative process and something that I would challenge you to constantly be re-examining while you're working on these projects. At some point, the final part of all of this will come up. And that is the point where you have to let go of what it is you're working on. And this is constantly a battle of all creatives, of anyone documenting the bizarre. We can become so attached to these stories, so attached to these cases, that we find ourselves almost unable to let them go. You'll seek perfection forever, and you'll never find it. If you don't learn to just let it go at some point, that will be a constant problem. And so I found over time that despite the fact that, yes, there are numerous ways to tell these stories and numerous things we can constantly be doing to sort of perfect what it is we're working on, the end point is putting it in front of an audience. Whatever it is you're working on, get it to the stage where you felt it needed to be at originally. Hopefully you're doing all the things I've already established, the themes, the human element, all those things you're putting in front of people and hopefully drawing them into the world that you're trying to create with the story you're telling. And then you just have to let it go. And that is an extremely difficult part of doing this, is just letting it go. But it is, like I said earlier, be too dumb to quit. Put this thing out in front of an audience. Let them make of it what they will. Hopefully you've done the work in the process of creating whatever it is you're creating, and you'll put it in front of people, and hopefully they're going to see the value in it that you saw. These stories are extremely important to the history of our country, the history of the world. I genuinely believe that. Whether you believe in UFOs or cryptids or Bigfoot, whatever, whether you think there's any value in these stories or not, there's a huge value in the stories to our country and to the small communities, especially where they took place. That's what drew me to all of this. So I hope you guys enjoyed this and were able to take something from it. I want to see more people telling stories in this world. I always say I do not see there being such a thing as competition in this space, because we need more people telling these stories. We need more people that see the value in them. And I hope that's you. And I hope you enjoyed this talk. Thanks for watching.